And this is my cabin on the ship Zatendolna. The year is 1770. Captain James Cook has begun his first journey. Prince Louis Auguste of France has married the Austrian princess Marie Antoinette, and Joseph Priestley invented the first pencil eraser. In the American colonies, however, there is increased unrest due to several enforced taxations on the American people, leading up to one of the incidents to begin the American Revolution, the Boston Massacre.
An incident on King Street in Boston, where a group of British soldiers fired upon a mob of unruly colonists, resulting in 5 deaths and the arrest of the soldiers involved.
There is much more to the Boston Massacre than is portrayed in the famous print by Paul Revere. So, let's take a look at the whole story.
After the costly French and Indian War, the British government was cleaned of several gold sovereigns and shillings. In order to raise revenue and pay expenses, Parliament imposed a series of taxes, including those of the Sugar Act, Townshend Acts, and Stamp Act, on the citizens of the American colonies, without any representation of the Americans in Parliament.
The Massachusetts House of Representatives tried several attempts to counter the Townshend Acts. They sent a petition to King George III to repeal the Townshend Revenue Act, which of course was ignored, then sent what was known as the Massachusetts Circular Letter to the other colonial assemblies, asking for them to join the resistance. And finally, they called for a boycott of merchants importing the taxed goods.
With increased unrest in Boston due to the imposed taxes, Colonial Secretary Lord Hillsborough instructed the North American Commander-in-Chief General Thomas Gage to send whatever troops necessary to Boston. From 1768 to 1770, several clashes between civilians and soldiers occurred, with some accounts of events being overly exaggerated. The propaganda of conflicts inflamed tensions of the Bostonians, with both civilians and soldiers seeking confrontations with each other.
On the eve of the massacre, March 5th, Private Hugh White was on guard duty outside the Custom House on King Street in Boston. After a wigmaker's apprentice named Edward Garrick called out to a British officer about unpaid bills, which were in fact settled, Private White told Garrick to be more respectful to the officer. Garrick hurled insults at White, which made White leave his post, challenge Garrick, and strike Garrick on the head with his musket.
Garrick's companions began to argue with White, leading to the attraction of a larger crowd on the street. A 19-year-old bookseller named Henry Knox came onto the scene and warned Private White not to fire, or else he would die for it.
As the evening progressed and a larger crowd gathered around Private White, a corporal and 6 privates of the 29th Regiment of Foot sent by Captain Thomas Preston came to relieve White. Upon reaching White at the Custom House, the soldiers loaded their muskets, and Preston shouted to the crowd of over 300 civilians to disperse.
The crowd, led by mixed-race runaway slave Crispus Attucks, taunted the soldiers and threw snowballs at them. A thrown object hit Private Hugh Montgomery, causing him to fall and drop his musket. After recovering his weapon, he was thought to have shouted to the soldiers to fire.
After a brief pause, the soldiers under Captain Preston fired a ragged series of shots into the crowd, hitting 11 men, killing 3, and wounding 4. As the crowd dispersed, Acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson was summoned and agreed to hold a fair inquiry into the shootings. By morning, Preston and the 8 soldiers involved were arrested.
3 days after the massacre, a ceremony was held to bury the first 4 victims: ropemaker Samuel Gray, mariner James Caldwell, apprentice ivory turner Samuel Maverick, and Crispus Attucks. Irish immigrant Patrick Carr died March 14th and was buried with the others 3 days later. Next business was the trials for the soldiers and civilians accused for murder.
It was very hard for Preston and the soldiers to find a defense attorney, since several loyalist lawyers refused to defend them. In the end, Preston sent a request to a 34-year-old lawyer from Braintree, Massachusetts, a leading patriot who was considering a run for public office. His name would soon go down in history as being one of the biggest champions for American freedom, John Adams.
Funny enough, it was John Adams' cousin Samuel Adams who got him involved in the trial, along with his cousin Josiah Quincy. Really, Samuel Adams wanted to show the British that the Americans were not just a bunch of lawless barbarians. John Adams, as well, agreed that the law must be represented.
Thanks to Adams, 6 of the soldiers were acquitted of charges of manslaughter, while 2 were found guilty due to evidence of them firing directly into the crowd. The sentence, though, was reduced from death to a simple branding of the thumb in open court.
After the trials, Captain Preston retired from the army and settled in Ireland. Henry Knox joined the Patriot cause, befriending George Washington and being made Chief Artillery Officer of the Continental Army. When Washington was elected president in 1789, Knox served as his first Secretary of War. Josiah Quincy traveled to England in 1774 to argue the American cause to the British sympathetic to the colonies, but died of tuberculosis before he came within sight of Massachusetts in 1775. John Adams, for his work in the trials, was elected to the Massachusetts General Court, and later the Massachusetts seat in the Continental Congress. He worked with Benjamin Franklin in Paris, then Holland and Great Britain, before becoming Vice President under George Washington, and later Second President of the United States. He died on the same day as Thomas Jefferson, at the ripe old age of 90.
But what of Crispus Attucks? Can you give us some enlightenment, Tracy?
Meet my fellow revolutionary and dear friend, Crispus Attucks. You can see John Hancock has black friends.
Uh-huh. And where did you two meet?
Why, we met at the Sons of Liberty gathering. When was that, Crispus? 1775?
Really? So 5 years after Crispus Attucks was killed in the Boston Massacre?
Run, Crispus! He's onto us!
Thank you, Tracy.
Really, Attucks became an icon of the anti-slavery movement of the 1700s, and since he was part of the Wampanoag, he held special significance in the Native American community. But he is most remembered as being the first martyr of the American War of Independence.
Now, the closest associated image to the Boston Massacre is that of the famous printing by Paul Revere. Is this printing true to the story, or has it been overly sanctified in a few respects?
Actually, it was an artist named Henry Pelham who made the original drawing. Paul Revere copied Pelham's image with a few details to stretch out the truth a little. For instance, Captain Preston is ordering his men to fire, when in reality he was trying to keep the peace. Revere's engraving appeared in the Boston Gazette as a piece of anti-British propaganda, and giving a new name to the British regular infantry, Bloodybacks.
Thank you for tuning in. I am Captain Tim Rutledge, and I wish you a good day. See you soon.